What's going on, everyone? Welcome to episode 55 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. It's been a little bit since episode 54, but we've been busy. We haven't been chilling too much. So had a few things going on, including but not limited to a recent preprint that we put up on the Sport RXIV. Is that the right? Yeah, there we go.
Sport Archive, yep.
Sport Archive. With a recent preprint that Zach led among some excellent co-authors we had the pleasure to collaborate with. We'll probably do some longer episodes and some more content on that in the future. We're going to kind of put a pin in that for now. There's a ton to discuss. It's a very long paper. Lots of things that I think are kind of going under the radar. For example, very little discussed about strength so far. There's a good amount to discuss in terms of the analyses that we chose. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I would keep in mind it's a very long paper, and it can be a little bit interesting to hear takes within 24 hours of it being put on the server. Before any further updates, Zach, any comments on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just the same exact thing you said. Like, there's just so many things in that, stylistic choices, little subjectivity things that just completely did not hit the initial wave of the traffic that I got on the internet. So that's something I'm really looking forward to discussing in, the adequate depth. Thankfully, there's been some really solid long form discussions that I've been fortunate enough to be a part of that hopefully will continue to kind of get a lot of the nuance and stuff out. And then of course we'll take kind of all the different stuff that's come across our desk in terms of the way that the results and everything have been discussed and try to, give as much nuance and conceptualize things in a way that's practical and helpful based on all the understanding of the little details that went into things, like you said. So, a lot to come from that project we're just kind of waiting to let everything kind of settle and give people the time to digest the results and everything before we dive into that. As you said, there's a ton to discuss. So yeah, it's been good. It's been awesome. It's received a ton of good feedback and that kind of stuff. So I'm excited to, keep pushing towards publication. But yeah, it's been cool to see what everybody thinks and get some feedback on it. But yeah, I'm excited to keep moving here and discuss what we got today. Nice segue.
Well, I'm gonna kill your segue because I think it's important to note like that's the point of a preprint, right? Is to get that feedback and ultimately improve the manuscript to ensure its highest quality before publication. So that's, I guess, can kind of, in addition to some other things we have going on, kind of explain why we'll drag our feet a little bit in terms of talking about it on our show, because I think there is a ton to discuss from a practical perspective. And also, I think some cool discussions to be had about things we were wrong about, ways it's kind of shifted, just the whole process of what's gone into it. And Zach led the project, but it was a very long and just high workload project, again, especially for Zach. But ultimately that whole process to some degree, I think kind of shifts just how we think about research in general, because the results in a lot of ways did surprise us. Right. And I think there's just some good reflections that we'll definitely bring forward. And I think will be helpful for the listenership as well. We also were at the ACSM conference recently, presented some research from our lab. So that was a good time. That can explain the gap between episodes 54 and 55 a little bit. But, some really exciting stuff with different collaborators. I'm really excited about what's to come just in the next few years with research in general. We spent some time with Milo Wolf, discussing some of the projects he's working on. I believe he recently submitted his PhD. So some of his stuff will be coming out relatively soon, I believe. We have a good amount of stuff in the work that will be coming out. Some soon, some not so soon, but nonetheless, some exciting stuff, and also some stuff that's going to overlap with the topic of today's episode, which is another preprint on the topic of Deloads. So this one was spearheaded by Zach, so I'll kick it over to you, Zach. Just give a little primer on what the study was, some of the main take-homes, then we can jump from there.
We got it. Yep. So we'll keep the discussion of the actual study relatively brief. I think the newsletter does a good job kind of going into the details of the actual study, but just a very brief overview. It's honestly a really straightforward training study. A good amount of participants randomized into the two groups. One group performed 9 weeks of training straight. Particularly, we're going to discuss the lower body outcomes because those are supervised, while an upper body training program was performed unsupervised. twice per week, relatively high volumes, multi-joint, single-joint exercises both included in the program. They trained every set to volitional failure, so relatively fatiguing conditions on paper. And one group trained all 9 weeks continuously, while the other group just took out that very middle 5th week and just did an entire week off and zero training. And they compared strength and hypertrophy outcomes. A very brief overview of the results. You could go into a little bit more detail on this, but for the most part, pretty modest differences between groups. The one relatively surprising thing would be that the strength outcomes tended to lean in favor of the group that did not take a deload. There's a few reasons for that. Ultimately, I think if we're just going to simplify why I believe that's the case, is purely because the deload is probably unnecessary in these conditions. Both some of the subjective information that came from the participants having conversations with the researchers and just the way the overall kind of study was designed in terms of the programming, et cetera. It is kind of arguable if the deload was really needed. And actually, a lot of the participants after the study said that despite this being the hardest they'd ever trained, they still didn't think they needed a deload after the study. So there was quite a few different lines of pointing to that the deload is potentially unnecessary. And the fact that they took an entire week off training, potentially, particularly for strength outcomes, might have just kind of lost the groove for practicing the strength task to be tested, particularly because they weren't training with heavy loads. So every set, kind of the motor skill stimulus or the strength skill stimulus, was relatively inefficient, I would say. That's by design. It's not a critique by any means. It's just kind of the way the study was set up, and probably favored the group that was practicing those exercises that additional week, didn't lose that the disruption of kind of load progression and just practicing the skill and all those kind of things. So I think that's probably why things kind of shook out the way they did. One thing I want to be very clear about that has just been astounding to me, how this is the community kind of takes these things. First and foremost, shout out to Max Coleman. I've been in touch with him. He did an awesome job with this project. And I think first and foremost, I don't think people realize how much goes into a training study, let alone with how many participants that they had in this study. So hat tip to you, Max, as we've already discussed. Awesome job. And I don't think people realize how much work goes into these projects. So just so you know, we are well aware of that, and congratulations on this. But the main point I want to make is that I just don't think people realize the way you can set up kind of a line of research. So when I made the post about this newsletter, I would say over 75% of the comments were, well, people don't take a week off in real life. And the reality is, particularly for this question, it's really challenging to investigate in a normative time frame for college age students, right? The challenge you have when you initially start a line of research is you're trying to differentiate the conditions as much as possible to elicit some sort of an effect. And generally, the first few studies, you're trying to go for a little bit more on the internal validity side to see if we can find something. And then we'll move across the spectrum back to the ecological validity side that mimics more so what people do in practice, so we can get a better estimate of the actual effects that we may see, in real life training. So deloading is particularly challenging because you literally have 1 week of difference throughout the training intervention. Consider a volume study. A volume study, every single week of the training intervention, there's something substantially different. In a deload, there's literally 1 week that's different. So a lot of what I was saying to a lot of the people that were making these comments, which again is a totally fair comment. I don't disagree. That is a limitation and should influence the way that we view the results of the study. But ultimately, from a researcher side of things, what is probably going to show the most substantive effect from a fatigue reduction perspective, any sort of physiological resensitization, and potentially any sort of accumulated fatigue reduction? All of the theoretical mechanisms for why deloads would be beneficial, even some of the subjective stuff in terms of training monotony, strain, things like that, you would suspect an entire week off would be the most potent way to elicit those effects. So thus, it's probably a justifiable choice for the very first study. And that is what I just don't understand. People are just not understanding about this project to kind of get the ball rolling for being literally the first training intervention to investigate deloads in a somewhat of a systematic fashion that is pretty directed and not kind of like an indirect way of looking at it. So I wish people would have a little bit more, grace maybe is the right word, of understanding how this process goes. And I think it's a perfectly justifiable choice for the first deload study, and I'm sure whether it's this group or other researchers are going to continuously build on this study, understanding that here's what this results found. Let's move more in the ecologically valid direction and see, how that influences the results. So yeah, so I just wanted to put that out there. I think it's easy to, be an armchair researcher and kind of point and pick flaws. And that was a lesson I learned very, very early on, thankfully for one of my mentors, pointed that out to me. It said it's very easy to critique a study, but knowing what goes into it and the decisions that need to be made, I think is sometimes important to have a little bit of humility and understand some decisions have to be made for certain reasons that aren't always immediately apparent. So I think this was a really, really, really high quality first step for this area of research. Excited to see where it goes. Obviously, it's limited in what it can tell us from a practical perspective directly, but it's interesting nonetheless, provides some idea fuel and gets people talking about this topic. I think probably more in depth than it usually is. I think deloads are kind of one of those things that people just kind of accept, and probably not as much thought gets put into it as other training variables because we have so much more research on that. But now even this has probably got us talking a little bit as somebody who, I think one thing you could take away from this study is it's probably a little bit more pro-reactive deload than proactive deload. And anybody that's followed our stuff for long enough knows that that might be one of our slightly more controversial programming opinions, I would say. I think most people nowadays are pretty pro. Deloads. Yeah, I'd say most people are pretty pro reactive deloads nowadays, and I think we are one of few that I don't want to say we only use proactive deloads, but I'd say we would use them relatively frequently.
Yeah.
So yeah, that kind of just a monologue here to start to kind of get us rolling here. But honestly, I think where we want to take this conversation is just how do we think about deloads? How do we take this information and also just all of our practical experience and actually put something on the paper for a client or for ourselves when we're looking to program. So Josh, any thoughts on the monologue here to start? And then let's just talk deloads.
Yeah. Let me just kind of echo what you said, man, because even at minimum, like putting the actual data aside that the field now has, this, like seeing this come out only helps people build upon it, right? Like, for example, for us, this study is certainly going to inform study designs that we will execute in the coming years, 100%. So that in and of itself is awesome. And I'd also say there's probably a reason this is the first study directly on deloads because of those limitations that you mentioned. If you're constrained to, I think this study was 9 weeks. If you're constrained to like max 12, maybe 13 or 14 weeks, and like you said, a deload being, 10, maybe 20% of that time at most, things get really, really tricky. And that's something I'm currently working on personally, is trying to design an intervention study in this general ballpark, but have the protocols be different enough to actually potentially detect an effect if there is one. Because like you said, you kind of want to stack the study design to potentially detect an effect if there is one, so that, again, you can kind of walk it back in terms of ecological validity and determine whether it's even worth walking it back in terms of those additional follow-up studies. So I think that's just so important to mention, right? And this is just, another clue to kind of inform deloads in general. And also the concept of resensitization, which is something that I think the authors did a good job of mentioning in both the intro and the discussion as like a potential mechanism of why deloads might be beneficial. And also just, deloads in general and fatigue management. So Zach, if you're cool with it, I think we should discuss resensitization to start, because I'm particularly interested in that topic. And again, I think the authors emphasize that a good amount for good reason.
Go for it, Chief.
Okay. So I think people are to some degree overlooking the fact that this study to some degree did see resensitization for hypertrophy and dynamic strength. There's the isometric strength outcome that did lean in favor of that traditional group, so the continuous training group, a good amount. But like at the same time, a listener of this show cares about dynamic 1RM strength anyway. So the only reason you would really care about isometric strength is for clues for 1RM strength, and we have that 1RM strength. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that the 1RM strength was essentially within the bounds of something that you would just say, okay, it was essentially a wash between groups. So anyway, one group trained for 8 of the 9 weeks, and one group trained for 9 of the 9 weeks, and the results were more or less the same. So that is indeed resensitization to some degree, or it could just be that the differences between groups were not large enough to potentially see an effect. So I think that's important to keep in mind, is that the deload kind of worked, right? Like, it didn't harm results. And I think that, really leaning into that isometric strength finding that did, again, lean in favor of that continuous group would be, I guess a slam dunk if you don't like deloads, but I wouldn't really take that position to say that, the deload group did significantly worse. So then we kind of take a step back and say, okay, we have this data. What would have to be true for resensitization to actually increase outcomes over the course of a training study, or if you think of just more practically, over the course of a training year or a training decade, or whatever the case may be? Essentially, what you would need is the improved rate of progress after the detraining period or the lower training volume period. That improved rate of progress would have to outweigh the decreased rate of progress from the detraining period. So I'm optimistic that there's a certain way to design a deload or some sort of like actually targeted resensitization period in order to elicit a net positive effect compared to a continuous training group, or I should say a net greater hypertrophy or strength effect. On one hand, taking a complete week off of training is probably the best way to truly resensitize skeletal muscle to the training stimulus. But that complete rest does come at a cost as well, right? It comes at the cost of increased soreness when you return from training. I think we can probably assume that. You're also probably going to have to take a step back in terms of training loads that you're using, and kind of have to reprogress loads back up from there, which also might negatively influence training a little bit, because you kind of have to relearn the movements that first session or two back in because you feel a little bit rusty. And I think that's also supported based on some of the just subjective notes that the authors put in the discussion, that the subjects felt a little bit lethargic, I believe was the word they used, after that deload week. And I would also just say, like, for myself, if I take a week off for a vacation or some other reason, I typically just kind of feel out of rhythm, right? So anyway, to kind of summarize, yes, I think that 1 week off can resensitize an individual to training, but complete training cessation probably comes at too many costs, right? And the next step in my mind, right, is to investigate a deloading period or a resensitization period that is reduced training, that can potentially still allow for that resensitization effect that arguably we saw here in this study, but without the negative effects that might have kind of held them back a little bit and potentially led to a wash in this case. So that's what I'm really excited to think about and potentially see additional data on in the coming years with resensitization, because that can inform deloads, that can inform long-term programming, that can inform periodization, especially for people with multiple goals, and also just a cool way to get more out of less, which was essentially the title of this paper. So Zach, do you have any thoughts on that? I think resensitization was a bit of a focus in the manuscript, so I think it's worth talking about here.
Yeah, this topic's interesting, and there's just so many different ways you can kind of slice the bread, I think, to kind of discuss this. First and foremost, like you said, the one thing is that this type of design, although potentially less common to what people do, probably has the highest probability of eliciting physiological resensitization. We've talked about this a couple times, but really the limited evidence that we have on this is that the decrease in training stress necessary to actually elicit meaningful resensitization is probably pretty strong. Like, we have a couple of studies that do complete periods of training cessation. I can't remember how long the Ogasawara study doesn't have people trained, but that's probably the best evidence that we have.
Multiple weeks.
Yeah, multiple weeks. So the periods that have reliably shown resensitization, and by that we mean increasing the rate of muscle growth in a given period of time, take some pretty extreme measures. And so in this case, an entire week off training, although that's not exactly what we would expect, seemed to at least lead to relatively similar things. Now, I've seen some takes on social media that, let's count here just to be accurate. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 out of the 9 between group effect sizes did favor the traditional group. But as Josh said, and I would be very surprised if those were outside of typical measurement error. Every single one of the point estimates is within the trivial standardized mean difference category. So I wouldn't take that to the bank by any means, but just putting that out there, as I've seen some people discuss it that way. To me, the only other thing that could potentially be playing a role here is that while it seems insignificant, 1 week out of a 9-week training intervention could be a decent amount of volume load, particularly when it's 20 sets within a week. So I've thought about that as well in terms of playing somewhat of a role, because they didn't necessarily make that up, right? There's the differences there as well. But ultimately, I think, like you said, because they reached a relatively similar point, we can't know for sure, but it to some degree could help us say that maybe there was a little bit of resensitization here because they reached the same point with less overall training and less overall time. The only other thing that I don't have like well-formed thoughts about this, and I haven't really looked for evidence to kind of justify this, but I've heard it discussed, is kind of the term of like ceiling effects. So like whether there's a physiological barrier to growing muscle or gaining strength in a period of time that you can't surpass. So it could be that one group isn't necessarily resensitizing, but both groups are just hitting this physiological barrier that we can't grow faster than, right? So that's another limitation that's kind of impossible to get around. But it's a thought I've had a few times. But yeah, man, honestly, this is probably up there with our most interesting research kind of things, I would say, because Josh and I both kind of speculate is that there is probably some way you can periodize hypertrophy training to improve outcomes. It's just the current discussion around that has been, at least in the research, almost entirely designed around strength. So we both kind of feel that saying periodization isn't necessary for hypertrophy is not totally a well parsed out statement. I would say I'm relatively agnostic about periodization for hypertrophy, but I think the candidate approaches that I think would actually be relatively effective, I don't think have been investigated. And this kind of resensitization concept, I think, is probably the biggest quote unquote mechanism to try to leverage. And honestly, I have more questions than answers, and this study doesn't really help. It just provides more evidence that's interesting, and less time and less volume load leading to relatively similar outcomes. One could potentially say that's why. Obviously, it's very challenging to know. But yeah, more just kind of spitballing here. And I find this topic really interesting. And I know this is something you're extremely interested about, as your dissertation probably will take some steps towards this topic and some more ways that, we think would be pretty cool to answer some questions related to this. But I don't know if you have anything else to say. I mostly just rambled and brought up ideas that didn't really have any formula behind them.
No, I think it's good. It's a unbelievably tricky area to research, because with something like volume or proximity to failure, a good study design simply holds everything constant except for the variable of interest here. Whereas you can do that, but the deload period or the resensitization period is subject to is subject to discussion, if you will, or there's a lot of different ways to design the length of that period, and also the differences between groups in terms of those overall workload during those periods. So it's a tough area to study. Are we going to have answers in the order of years? Probably not, but I think we'll be able to get additional insights as we go here. It's probably a good time to move on to things that we feel a little bit more comfortable, or have a little bit more, I guess, direct experience discussing, right? Because this whole resensitization stuff is kind of in the clouds. I think it's interesting to talk about, but it's hard to provide practical take homes at the current moment. But probably a good kind of jumping off point here is just practical ways you might program like a proactive versus a reactive deload and when each of those might be called for.
Nice. Yeah. So I think probably the way that I've thought about deloads has changed a little bit over time. But like you said, I think the main thing is that one thing I think is probably unfair about proactive deloads that often gets talked about is like, I would say it's very similar to the conversations around like percentage of 1RM versus RPE, in the sense that RPE is better in every single case because it's individualized. It allows for auto-regulation, all these benefits. And then percentage of 1RM is viewed in like a complete Stone Age lens where there's absolutely zero adaptability. It says 77.5%, and I have to do that on the day. There's no flexibility. That's obviously not how, people that use that tool would advocate for it if they're kind of taking into account some of these critiques. Each tool has strengths and weaknesses, and I think most people that are relatively open-minded can see that. And I think the same thing can be said about proactive versus reactive deloads. When we talk about proactive deloads, we're not saying that like, okay, 4 weeks in every single case, every single time you're going to deload. That's not really how
Three
I would
up, one
approach
down,
it.
man. Three up, one down. Let's go.
That's not how it goes. But I do think having, ultimately what I was going to say is like they can be individualized as well, and I think that's how we generally approach them. So in terms of like how I would actually go about determining which approach is better, there's a few things I kind of think about. And I think kind of the first main one is kind of just the main training goal of the individual. For whatever reason, I could go on a 30-minute rant of why. And Josh got the pleasure of trying to parse through my trying to articulate this. So I will save the listeners their ears bleeding of me trying to discuss this on here. But I think there are mechanisms of fatigue related to training for strength that are very hard to investigate in the scientific research that lend themselves well to proactive deloads. It's kind of a very hand-wavy anecdotal statement, but in my experience, that is kind of what I've noticed. And for the most part, and Josh, kind of tell me if you agree with this, purely from a conceptual basis, the name of the game for strength is just maintaining momentum. That has been the number one thing I've learned from working from really strong people that have just started training, people that have really favorable leverages for a given lift, people with very poor leverages for a given lift, people that are injury prone, people that seem they can get hit by a brick house and be totally fine. There's a lot of different things you got to take into account, but that concept of maintaining momentum and predictable training as much as possible, that's kind of the through line of training for strength long term, at least in my opinion and observations. And so when you are chasing these greater absolute loads all the time, whether it's psychological, whether there's physiological aspects to the fatigue that you can't really quantify currently, whether there's stuffs from just lifting literally heavier absolute loads, I don't know what it is. But in my experience, proactively managing that in some way when you're trying to push that up constantly on like the later weeks in a block with load progression just seems to be able to continuously roll that cycle back and keep that process going over and over again. Conversely, a physique athlete where I would say for both of us, almost entirely the kind of the base progression scheme there is going to be like some sort of double progression where you're still trying to progress things, you're still trying to add load, but the frame in which you're doing that, it's not really the priority. It's more so an outcome of good training, if that makes sense. I think that lends itself probably a little bit better to reactive deloads. And that's kind of the first principle I would say for me is like strength-oriented individuals. Most of the time, there's some cases we can talk about where it's not always the case, but most of the time I'll favor some sort of proactive approach that, of course, gets individualized over time. I would not just take an athlete the very first block and just automatically terminate the block at 3 weeks because that's what a periodization book from 1994 says. That's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to feel it out, check their fatigue patterns, kind of see their subjective feedback and kind of see when a natural stopping point kind of makes sense. And then I'll use that to kind of inform, generally speaking, kind of a proactive schedule from there. to which is obviously subject to change if there's a severe life event that significantly spikes fatigue up, or if we have a ton of crazy momentum with a very low amount of fatigue, we might extend things a little bit. But for the most part, we'll stick around that general time frame. And I'm planning most of the time proactively to kind of deload them on that certain schedule. Whereas physique athletes, I'll be a little bit more liberal with it, and cycles can go considerably longer depending on how things are going. But I'll stop there for now, Josh, and quit rambling. But what do you think about that general kind of framing?
Yeah, man, I think the difference here is strength versus hypertrophy training is, like at least just off the top of my head, I think a lot of people that advocate for reactive deloads are a little bit more in that hypertrophy sphere. That's not completely true, but I'd say on average that seems to be the case. If we're just focus on strength for a second, the way that I think about it is that predictability, momentum, and keeping the lifter as healthy as possible is like going to be the number one predictor of success over a long enough time scale. And the way that I think about it is like, okay, if you're training with a similar training stress, and you ran into kind of a fatigue wall, if you will, or the inability to have a productive training week on week number 6 in the past, and that general pattern seems to repeat itself over time with this particular individual, why go to week 6 and kind of like push over the edge just in the name of reactive deloads are better? I think you can probably create a decent counter argument against what I just said, but that would just be like the simplified view of why I would prefer to do a proactive deload. And I would also say that they're not mutually exclusive. So as a bit of a plug here for Infinity Programs, the way that we have it there is we kind of have like a wave loading pattern as like the base approach. So you have an introductory week, you have what we like to call climb weeks, and those can be 2 or 3 weeks, and then you have an attack week. And that attack week is when you really get after it in terms of top sets. That's when you're touching generally the highest RP of the block, and just your overall, I guess, aggression and load selection is on the higher end, right? Most of the time, we find lifters can just move right into that introductory week of the next block and the lower volume. Even if there's some changes to like rep ranges or exercise selection, they can simply recover during that week and kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone, kind of work through that wave loading pattern as they go. But that's definitely not the case for all lifters and for a given lifter at all times. So for that reason, we have the ability to reactively deload after that attack week. You just press a button, boom, that reactive deload shows itself, and you have an easier week of training. Now, again, to kind of, even though we were saying that these people were probably being a little bit unreasonable in the comments section, that deload week is still designed to maintain training momentum and apply some stimulus to at least maintain overall muscle mass and ensure you don't kind of backslide in terms of hypertrophy. So maybe a reduction of overall workload by like 30 to 60%, somewhere in that range. So for strength, I've tried the whole reactive thing. I've tried just going until we feel like it's time to deload, but then things just become so unpredictable. And once you kind of have that predictable time period, at which point, you kind of know that the block is done, it just makes like planning easier as well. Okay, we're 10 weeks out. Let's try to hit a really hard, heavy week here. Then we'll kind of pull back, work back up, hit it here, and then taper, and then go into the meet, something like that, right? And that predictability and fatigue management that I think comes from proactive deloads has gone a long way in our experience, but there's a lot of kind of priors within our programming approach that lead us to that, right? For example, we like to have those attack weeks where we kind of proactively decide this is the week you're going to really get after it. Whereas in a system where you don't do that, it's more heavily auto-regulated in the sense of, beyond just kind of selecting loads based on the desired RP, there's also ranges within that RP, right? If you have someone work up to a single at 6 to 9, right, and just kind of fall within that range based on how you're feeling, as opposed to landing at a single at 8, just adjusting load based on how you're feeling, that can have different downstream implications on whether you do a proactive versus a reactive deload. So anyway, long way of saying, with some of the concepts within programming that we like to use, that I outlined some of them there, I think proactive deloading works a little bit better, or at least proactive lower stress weeks with kind of that wave loading approach that we mentioned. And then reactive deloads can be implemented kind of on an as needed basis throughout a training cycle. But then on the hypertrophy side of things, honestly, man, I just think it's a totally different game because you have so much flexibility in terms of exercise selection that, like, if you're dealing with aches and pains on a considerable basis, just change the exercise, man. Like, there's so many other options. Whereas for strength, you can't always do that. And that's, again, one of the top reasons we might choose to do a proactive deload. So it depends on the goal, depends on kind of your priors and your general approach to programming, and to what degree you kind of value that predictability as well.
That's a good way to put it. I think for strength, you're kind of trying to make the what's the right way to say it? Basically, the fixed components like of exercise selection and the load, like you have these fixed things that you know, relatively speaking, kind of have to do to progress things for the strength test and the exercise that you're interested in. And I think that makes it so that some things kind of have to work around that. But with hypertrophy, because things, like you said, you literally can do essentially for all intents and purposes, you know, pretty much any rep range, pretty much any exercise, relatively wide range of set volumes. Like, there's so many different levers you can pull to kind of get the fatigue patterns to agree with whatever the situation is, that it's probably better just to do that instead of having to pull back on the entire the whole thing, right? Whereas strength, obviously, you kind of have to make these certain things work. So we might have to be a little bit more aggressive with the fatigue management accordingly. And I think that entirely aligns with the way that I've kind of come to things. And yeah, it's just like, I think you'd have to be pretty, I'm just not convinced that like being 1 week off or 2 weeks off of like what somebody could theoretically tolerate over the long run is like going to substantially change the game. Even though you can see people like talk about like how much like what percentage of training volume the difference is over like 20 years, something like that. I don't know, man. I think, like you said, the number one thing that I've come to realize with working with a lot of people at this point is if we can keep somebody healthy and their training is at least able to take small steps forward consistently, that's just going to trump essentially everything. So like on most things, I'm going to take the little bit more conservative route to try to, particularly in the strength context, because of that. And I think deloading fits in there perfectly. And I think this is especially the case when you have somebody with a relatively large injury history. Mm-hmm. I think that, and like we just said, like that's kind of the name of the game. And so when you have somebody who's been kind of has a nagging issue of any type, I think the proactive approach is just really useful, honestly, because it kind of gets you to that point where you can kind of hopefully avoid those issues at all times, at least trying to stay ahead of it. It's not always going to work, but in my experience, taking a proactive approach where I'm not waiting till symptoms arise, I'm trying to stay out ahead of them very aggressively, I think has been something that has been a pretty good change to the way that I've worked with a few clients with some pretty nagging injuries. I was going to say one more thing. Oh, the only other thing I was going to say is we talked to Mike a good amount about the whole time to peak thing, and I think that's been something that I've kind of done a 180 on over time. Is like the initial probably overconfident younger version of myself was like, there's no physiological reason why time to peak should be a thing. And then, you know, I talked to Mike a few more times, realized he's a very reasonable person and has thought about most of the critiques I would bring up to something. And just like we were just talking about, like, it doesn't really matter why it happens, but it kind of seems to. Mm-hmm. So whether that's, you know, kind of a psychological expectation over time, you start to identify with a certain number of weeks, whether that's just the pattern of life in which things kind of time up that way. Like there's all these societal things that kind of can come to these kind of waves of things that kind of just get reinforced. And mm-hmm. I don't think that's like a bad thing. Ultimately, it's kind of what I'm getting at is like, we talk about this all the time, but like, I think Josh does a really good job of like aligning a lot of the little variables around these kind of cycles in training. Like I know you're pretty good about like periodizing caffeine intake, periodizing the degree of psychological arousal you use, periodizing, the amount of like us in the training environment to try to get you, to hit the heaviest peak load. Like all those things kind of are on like a timer that kind of like are aligned in that way. And I think that predictability can be beneficial in a lot of ways. And I think that's kind of goes along with the time to peak thing of like those types of patterns I think can emerge. And I think reactive or proactive deloads can help to elicit those further. And I think people just kind of like operating in that way. So I don't really know where I'm going with this, but ultimately I think that's an interesting concept of this whole discussion of like, even if you were to reactively deload, I would be pretty surprised that doesn't happen on a relatively consistent schedule, if that makes sense.
Would you characterize kind of that reactive training systems time to peak model as proactive? It's tricky, right? And and that's kind of when we were writing the newsletter. And I also don't want to like mischaracterize what someone else does. So take it with a grain of salt. But when we were writing when Zach wrote the newsletter and I was kind of helping him edit it, when you were kind of talking about proactive versus reactive deloads, I tried to kind of make that distinction between an individualized proactive deload and a non-individualized proactive deload. I'd say like if you're just looking for the simplest take home from the study, it's probably not required to do non-individualized proactive deloads.
Yep.
What we would potentially favor in practice, just based on our experience in the absence of a ton of research on this, is individualized proactive deloads with reactive deloads as needed. And I think that individualized versus non-individualized aspect to a proactive deload is quite important.
Yep. Yeah,
so I'd say at this point go for
it. I mean, you just won the game because you used both of them. So
yeah, exactly.
Checkmate losers, like we got both of them on our side. Yeah, we use proactive deloads, but sometimes reactive too. So bulletproof approach.
We train hard and we train smart. we train to failure and with high volumes. We train once a week and every day.
Yeah,
high frequency and low frequency. Boom.
Yeah.
No, I'd say like we kind of do like use time to peak, at least. Maybe we don't call it that or like are directly thinking of that that concept or that term, but I think it's almost hard to avoid when you notice those patterns over time with an individual, which is another thing to keep in mind, right? Like if you've been working with someone for 2 years, this stuff starts to become apparent. But if you're like 6 months into working with someone, it's like, seems to go pretty well in week 4 or seems to go pretty well in week 5. So I would kind of note that as a word of caution. It's often not quite as clear as you might think, right? Like, hey, turns out that Father's Day was a few days ago before recording this, and I was just talking to someone why his attack week performance wasn't quite as good as it might have otherwise expected to be after 18 holes and probably a dozen drinks the day before might have impacted that a little bit. So those are other things to keep in mind, right? It's just like, in practice, it's a little bit messy as well. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. Honestly, coming back to the RTS thing, I don't really know. I'd be curious to hear what they say. I think probably definitely initially it's a reactive system. Mm-hmm. But I'd be curious to hear what, John or Mike or somebody that's been kind of operating under that system for a long time, what they would say like 6 months, a year, multiple years in, how do they kind of operate that? I'm sure they do recalibrations on kind of time to peak every now and again, but there's probably a window in there where it's relatively proactive, if I had to guess, which sounds like very similar to what we do. Is like once you have somebody kind of within a given structure, and you have a semi-repeatable pattern or something you wish to reinforce, which is kind of what I was getting at with the monologue that I just had earlier. One of those two things happens, then you're probably proactive for a good amount of time. And then once either the context changes, goals change, or the training approach needs to change substantially, then maybe you kind of recalibrate and see kind of how long does this take to manifest and those kind of things. So I would say honestly pretty similar to us, where you can't really put one word on them and pin them down, which I would assume for most people that are coaching strength athletes, they're probably gonna have a pretty similar answer.
So what do you think about like a back half deload or like just a 3 or 4 day deload
This
or one
this
easy
is what
session.
this is what I wanted to get into next. Kind of just the less standard approaches to this. So let's first talk about maybe the most standard kind of way, stock standard approach to deloading. So I would say most people that I'm aware of how they program a stock standard deload is to perform essentially the exact same training you were performing, cut the dosage in about half, and then maybe reduce the RP or load a little bit as well. Basically, I would say that's going to cover most people. Some alternative approaches that I definitely have started to utilize a little bit more have been keep training pretty much the same, but drop days off, or what you said, keep training the same in the first half of the week and potentially remove days or substantially reduce the dose of the last few sessions. Both of those, I haven't done the back half one. I definitely do a lot for tapering.
Different though.
Yeah, for sure. They are definitely different. I don't think I've used that for deloading, but I've definitely used the removing days instead of changing the protocols on a given session. And I think for people who don't really like kind of going through the motions isn't the right way to say it, because honestly, it's still pretty normal training. It's just less of it. Some people don't really like that, and they'd rather just train really hard a couple sessions and then just remove sessions. And some of the time you get back, psychological kind of resensitization and getting excited about training again can sometimes be a little bit better if you actually remove days rather than removing dosages from a given session. So it kind of just depends on why you're trying to leverage a deload sometimes, I think. But I've definitely had success with the former, but I haven't had a ton of practice with the back half deload. Have you?
Yeah, I used to use those almost across the board before I moved to like a wave loading structure. So I would just kind of deload pretty hard in the last week of a block, in the back half of that last week of the block, and then kind of jump right into the next block. But now I essentially never use that, and kind of my default approach is a wave loading approach. Probably has to do with just the value I've found in kind of having that big end to the block and then kind of working backwards from there. And then for a while, my kind of default approach was to have a deload and then an intro week and then build up to that, kind of big end to the block. And then I realized that, man, you're spending a good amount of time like deloading and introing. It's like, that's like could be like a third of your total training. So I was like, all right, let's just try dropping the deload. I found maybe 70 to 80%, at least within this model, don't really need that deload anyway. It's just move them right into the intro week, make sure there aren't any massive changes to exercise selection. Okay, we have an RDL in this block and we didn't have it in the last block. Let's make sure to really intro it. And if you're just kind of use some common sense on that end, I just wave load. I just don't really use deloads that much. And then when I think someone really needs like just a break from heavy loads in general, psychological break, etc., I would rather just program like a pretty non-specific, like 2 to 5 week block that just changes the goalposts. Especially for folks that have both strength and hypertrophy goals. After a hard strength block, just move them into a block where like you're trying to hit like a new 8RM on high bar squats at the end of the block. Like that can be really fun. And also your knees don't ache by the end of that block. It's pretty cool because, you're not low bar squatting not low bar squatting heavy twice a week. So that's the general approach that I take. And now I'm forgetting what the actual question was.
How aggressive are your intros, like in terms of like dose modification and like RP load modification? What do you say on average?
It's probably, if I were to just kind of subjectively say the workload of the average of the block, it would be like 65 to 75% of it.
And then load and RP are down as well.
Yeah, that kind of incorporates the load in the RP. So volume is maybe down 20 to 30%. RPs are on the low end of the progression that kind of builds them up to where they end. So now there's a lot that goes into that, right? Because sometimes I'll be aggressive with that kind of slope throughout the block. Yep. Other times I'll kind of start them really hard because they can handle it. Or other times I'll keep it really chill until that last week. So those are all subject to individualization. And anybody that's taken the lengthy infinity quiz knows that all those options are there for you. if you kind of want to dive into the specifics of each different kind of progression type I'm referring to here.
Interesting. Yeah, I would say so we've had a few conversations about the whole wave loading thing that I've definitely learned a lot from and trying to take some from. The on paper that sounds like a really good approach where you can kind of remove the potentially unnecessary week when the intro can kind of fulfill that purpose in the next block.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe I'll have to give that a little more thought, better tracks. I think I don't use that quite as frequently as you do. I've definitely shifted to more of a wave loading approach, but I still relatively frequently still include deloads. But I would say my sample size of coaching currently is pretty. The number one thing I'm trying to focus on is keeping people healthy. So I think I'm pretty heavy on that lever to make sure that fatigue is really washed out in those kind of cases. So that might be kind of a bias in my sample currently. But
if if you're hurt and you apply for coaching and it's the one time per year that Zach is thinking about taking on a client, then you can work with him.
Deload 75% of the year. Let's go.
Yeah, exactly. No, I just kind of noticed personally, and just obviously talking with lifters, that going deload intro and then building up, it's just like you feel like there's a lot of training time there that isn't like the total hard. Yeah, kind of a lag there. Exactly. Now I have some guys that really need that deload. Like I mentioned, I'd say 20 to 30%. I still have that deload before the intro, because if you just go right into that intro, man, like it can get pretty rough.
How much do you think that is based on the way they psychologically approach it? As opposed to like something that's, because I've noticed, and that probably plays into the slope that you're mentioning as well.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that to me is kind of the through line of like how, God, we need more research on how arousal impacts fatigue, man. Like that just is such a consistent coaching observation, but to my knowledge, there's really nothing we can point to that kind of mentions how that influences things. But I just really feel like it does. Like arousal, personality type, and just the way like psychologically a session is handled. Like some people go into like an intro week with the mindset of like, this is an intro week. Whereas some people are foaming at the mouth and have to literally, their friends have to tell them, do not put another plate on. It's RP6. You know what I mean? Like it's just very different in how people handle it. And I have to suspect that influences like implementing a deload in that case is like getting that person to kind of come down before they can ramp back up. Whereas some people that's unnecessary. And if the program will be sufficient in the fatigue reduction purely with what's on the page, it's kind of unnecessary. So I don't know. I'm just
in those cases, that's where, and by the way, I really liked your percentage versus RP analogy here for proactive versus reactive deloads. That's where which is a total side note, that's where I think percentage-based work is
facts.
Perfect, right? And I think you can still do that with an intro. Just like I'll actually do that quite frequently. Is I'll put like a load cap in the intro week only, and then the rest of the block will be RP based for a slot. Just because, like, all right, I know this person is going to have a hard time sticking to a true RP5, so I'm like, even on a good day, I don't see you going above this for an RP5. Do not go above this.
Yeah, terrible coach.
Yeah, no, that's the thing, man. Is like, I almost think like the most common question we get from people that inquire to work with us is, do you program using RP or percentages? And it's just, the answer is just kind of like a shrug. Same idea with like this proactive versus reactive. I think we'd kind of lean more on the proactive side. Same idea, we'd probably lean more on the RP side in terms of programming, but like, like they both have their places, right? And can be used, on a case by case basis. And that's kind of reflected in, I was going to plug Infinity again, but I'm not going to do it.
Oh man.
I have one more thing to talk about.
I got one more thing too, but we're really a wrap up thing.
Okay, you want me to go first then?
Yeah, go first. If yours not a total wrap up thing, yeah.
Do you think that simply changing the training stimulus instead of reducing the overall workload is sufficient to get a lot of the potential benefits of a deload? I think like the N1 crew would probably like lean towards the side of things, and I find myself doing it a lot without kind of like articulating it, if that makes sense, or actually like thinking that's what I'm doing. But then I kind of take a step back and I'm like, oh yeah, we did do that like kind of higher rep block or just change the exercises because they felt beat up. And for someone that's like has very high motivation to train, I'm going to lean that way as opposed to let's do like a resensitization block that's 3 weeks at 30% of your previous volumes and it's all 5 RAR because that's just not going to be as enjoyable for them. So anyway, long way of asking, can we just change the stimulus and keep the workload high, or do we have to actually reduce that workload?
So this is crazy you brought this up. This is something I have like a running notes file that I have in my computer from discussion about the meta.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the inverse of a topic that I've been thinking about. And it's something I think we both kind of think about intuitively, but haven't really expressed in the same words. So to simplify, the meta, more discussions between us, thinking about training. We've shifted over time to kind of this strength limiter kind of mindset about a lot of things. What we've never really thought about is the inverse of that. Is we have all these training variables that we can shift in certain ways. And in my opinion, the reason we see successful individual responses to certain batches of training in which others don't respond as well is because way more training variables and exercise selection influence the strength limiter than you realize. Load. Let's take load, for example. Load at submaximal proximities to failure, the loading demands are distributed to certain joints. As you get closer to failure, they're distributed to other joints. Right there, load could influence where the training stress is getting delivered and thereby influence what is going to see the most rapid progression in your strength. That's load. Proximity to failure, same exact thing. As you get closer to failure, almost certainly the loading demands are going to shift to other joints and distribute the training stress differently. That's, again, proximity to failure. Volume 3, it's going to amplify both of those two previous variables. Whatever you spend the most time doing, the training stress is going to be delivered there. So all of these things, and obviously exercise selection as well, is going to further modify that. All of those things are going to be organized in a different way to attack the strength limiter of an individual. And that's going to see the most rapid progression. But you could do the exact same thing in the opposite direction. And if you're putting all of this training stress towards a strength limiter, that's probably going to be the muscle group that's going to tap out in terms of fatigue as well. And if we flip the script on it and distribute all those variables away from the strength limiter, exactly what you just said, now we're distributing the stimulus in the exact opposite direction. And in a way, that could be viewed as a deload. So whether that's distributing things to more, shorter muscle lengths for, generally speaking, that's a little bit less efficient on a per set basis for hypertrophy, but in the deloading context, that may be perfect. Now we're changing those quarters to pennies. We're still moving forward. We're still delivering training stress, but in theoretically a less fatiguing way. Maybe we're taking, sets in a different proximity to failure than we were, in a different loading range than we were, to distribute the loading demands in a different way than what we were for kind of our meat and potatoes portion of the block, to, again, continuously develop the other musculature associated with the lift, but not be so concentrated on the strength limiter. That's probably going to, if we're really targeting the intervention, the fatigue of one thing may be very, very high. But if we dilute that a little bit, we may be able to train still with relatively high doses and relatively normal organizations of training, but in a more diluted fashion in terms of what we're attacking, and maybe can still take steps forward. It's a relatively unformed thought, but it's the inverse of the strength limiter conversation that I think takes some more chewing on. And so, long story short, you would ask me this 6 months, a year ago, I'd say you're crazy. Muscles respond to mechanical loading. No, what's a different stimulus? Like, sure, there's different metabolic things that occur, but I think, shout out to Milo again. I think that kind of muscle length stuff has opened my mind to maybe some differential aspects to relatively minor things that on its surface don't really seem like they're that different. But the more you dig into them and kind of stack all of these training variables together, I do think you can deliver a pretty substantially different stimulus. So yeah, I'm open to that idea much more than I used to be, and I don't really know where I would take that from a practical perspective. But I know there's coaches that, for example, will switch squats to like machine-based exercises and keep the number of sets similar, keep the RR similar, but switch the repetition range. And once again, I always try to align like what is the principle that's delivering the desired effect. And I think it's just distributing the training stress in a more diluted fashion, or just away from the portion of the musculature or the muscle itself that is going to be the primary strength limiter, but now also the fatigue limiter within a given training period. So yeah,
the fatigue limiter. Give me an example of that.
Just like, for example, you think you need to deload your squat because your quads are absolutely fried.
I see.
But if we deliver the training stimulus in a way that is it's still very challenging for the hip extensors, but substantially reduced for the quads, that's still like hard training on paper.
Yeah.
But it's shifted the stimulus or diluted it enough that the primary fatigue limiter that we're trying to attack in like a developmental portion of training is no longer getting the brunt of the load anymore. And so we're getting a little bit less of an efficient stimulus in the weeks that we're kind of doing that. But theoretically, if that's what's holding us back in terms of fatigue, then maybe we can keep pushing a little bit. That obviously assumes that systemic aspects of fatigue are maybe not as important, but it's a thought. I don't know. What do you think?
There's so many thoughts here. One thing I will say is like when I'm pulled back in terms of like squat, bench, deadlift training for myself personally, whether it's an intro week or a full deload week, I find myself just like kind of accidentally ending up at the gym that is walking distance from me and just like training arms and lateral delts and upper back for a couple sets just because, I don't know, I'm on a walk and I'm just going to stop by and hit some sets because I don't really feel like it's going to take away from the deload. So ultimately, I mean, the answer is we don't know, right? But these are the things that might want to be kind of going through your head when you're thinking about a deload period or a resensitization period or a fatigue management period or whatever the case may be. What's the reason for the deload? Is the deload for local reasons at the level of the musculature? Is it for psychological reasons? Is it kind of a global fatigue issue or again, more of like a local fatigue issue? Also, if we change the stimulus, like you said, maybe we change the range of motion that is overloaded or kind of the quote unquote limiting factor. Is the hypertrophy that we could see from a different training style, whether that's range of motion or rep range or exercise, is that additive or is that redundant? Because if it's, I think there's a good amount of reason to think it might be redundant and you're kind of ending up at the same spot in terms of what's actually going on at the local level anyway, via different training mechanisms. Lots of thoughts there, lots of caveats I could add there. But ultimately, we don't know. But if you take the stance that the deload is to decrease aches and pains, is to allow soreness to dissipate, then you could theoretically just simply change the training stimulus or bias the training stimulus in a different way, right? And this kind of goes back to some previous episodes of the podcast and of the newsletter on volume cycling, right? So if, like you said, the fatigue limiter is your pecs in a pec specialization block, there's no need to really deload everything. Just deload your pecs if that's kind of what's causing you to end the block, right? And in this case, if you're kind of cycling through different specialization blocks, you can just go right into that next specialization block and make sure that the pec volume is lower, which it of course would be if it's no longer being specialized. And that kind of leads me to like a wave loading approach that I typically do for lifters that are hypertrophy focused. And it's essentially cycling through a different emphasis in terms of muscle group. Typically 2 to 3 muscles per block are kind of emphasized. Then you don't really need a full-on deload. You just intro them and you kind of have a wave loading approach anyway. I like to have a little performance test at the end of each block. Okay, we're going to do a new 8 to 10 RM on dumbbell bench at the end of this block is kind of a nice little thing to shoot for instead of a single at 9 like you would for a power lifter. Lots of thoughts there, but potentially some considerations for the listener when thinking about how to do these things, because they are surprisingly practical, right? A lot of times we're talking about things in terms of designing a training day or a training week or even a training block. But then you start to stitch those blocks together with these long-term considerations based on training goal. And these are questions that if you're working with people, you're thinking about all the time. And we don't have the answers, but we can at least point out potentially some additional things to consider.
Yeah. I think my question would be redundant at this point. So I think that's a good place to wrap up. Little rust on this first episode, folks. Stick with us. A lot of discussions, a lot of
all over
of
the
thoughts.
place.
But no,
shall
honestly,
we sum up?
Yeah,
shall we sum up for the listener that maybe was a little bit confused the last 20 minutes?
Yeah.
Deloads, yay or nay?
Yeah. Deloads, are they making you weaker? Probs not.
Probs not. Yeah, deloads are fine. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we have good reason to believe that if you take a step back from training and then you come back to full training, you're probably going to see better kind of progress when you come back to training anyway. I would probably avoid full training cessation. Again, excellent design by the researchers. We know why they did it, but we probably wouldn't advise that in practice. If you do it here and there for a vacation, awesome. Enjoy your vacation. But most of the time, pull back, drop that workload to like 50%, and then boom, get back to normal training whenever you feel ready to rock. You're going to be just fine. There's a lot of different ways to slice it. And if you train to failure based on Robinson at all, no, I'm just kidding. Don't want to go there. You'll be good. So deloads definitely can be advised. Just make sure they're individualized, right? You don't need to deload because someone said you had to deload every 5th week or whatever the case may be. Just make sure you're not running yourself into a wall. Deload when you need to. Potentially try a wave loading approach. You're going to be good to go.
Cosign.
Cool. If you're not subscribed to the newsletter, what are you doing? You've made it to the end of this episode. We're literally like reviewing a couple studies for you, sending it to your inbox for free a couple times a month. Maybe it'll be kind of a topic review. Sign up for the newsletter. It'll be in the description, and you'll get the newsletters right to your inbox. There's a quick takeaway at the top. Don't have to read the whole thing. It takes like 15 seconds to read that takeaway. And then each article is pretty quick, a few minutes to read. Then you can listen to the podcast as well for some more ramblings on the topic. And yeah, also if you made it to this point, go ahead and leave a rating on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, whatever it's called. And we'll see you next episode.
See you.